I'm Taya.
I'm Elise.
I'm Julia.
And we're the team behind DANDIFLYIN, which is a biological product with the intent of reducing the effect of carbon dioxide in the environment using natural and engineered processes to create a flying plant which produces oxygen.
So it's widely known that the concentration of carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere is changing due to human activity. And carbon emissions come from both natural and man-made emissions. So natural sources include decomposition of organic material, respiration of living organisms, and oceanic release. But these natural emissions are balanced by carbon sinks, which are ecosystems that can absorb carbon so that too much doesn't accumulate in the environment, and that's called equilibrium because the carbon generated is absorbed by the sinks so that not too much can accumulate. But the problem is that human emissions have added to the carbon that's being released, and that's too much for the sinks, and humans have not supplemented their release with a man-made sink so that now too much carbon is accumulating in the atmosphere without a way for it to be absorbed. So the problem with too much carbon accumulating is that it causes two, I think, main effects. One is the greenhouse effect, because carbon is a molecule that can reflect heat back to the Earth. So when too much gets into the atmosphere, heat and infrared radiation end up going up and they come back down, which causes warming, and that contributes to a change in global climate, and it affects ecosystems. And another thing is when there's too much carbon, there can be ocean acidification, which is when the oceans absorb too much CO2, and that causes carbonic acid to form, and that affects marine life because sometimes shells for sea creatures can't form because of the acid levels are too high, and also that might affect the reproductive organs of some marine animals. So we made this stop motion about deforestation. So forests are a natural carbon sink, and human activity has been causing a decrease in forests because of encroachment, sometimes clear cutting for agriculture, and unsustainable logging practices. And deforestation contributes to 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions when all the trees are cut down. So, great.
Okay, so our environment contains a natural solution to some extent to convert or change the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This comes in the form of photosynthesis, or the process by which plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, convert it to glucose in their chloroplasts using light energy by taking electrons from the water, thus oxidizing the water and creating oxygen. This process is represented by the chemical equation on the screen. Without photosynthesis, as a reversal to respiration, oxygen on the Earth would be quickly depleted. We decided to harness the Earth's natural process of creating new oxygen and creating a interactive product design.
So in order to combat the issues that Julia was talking about, we looked at creating a plant that could fly while absorbing carbon dioxide and converting it to oxygen through the natural process of photosynthesis. And the plant would be contained in a spherical structure which retained water and contains hydrogen gas, allowing it to float. So in this, we began looking at different ways that we could design the plant in order to have it actually be able to float and survive at the same time. So we first thought about maybe using leaves that could form a sort of parachute, and then two separate sacs, one that would contain water and one that would contain some sort of gas, either hydrogen or helium. At that point, we hadn't really decided which one would be better. And yet this raised certain questions because we didn't know what the scale of the plant would be, we didn't know how it would be able to lift off, and we didn't know what materials would be best to use it for. So we moved into a second design, which was looking more at aerodynamics and how we could rearrange the components into a more dynamic plant that would work better. So we still had the parachute leaves, but the water sac was contained inside the hydrogen sac, and then we were looking at how we could use natural membranes to make this plant.
So finally, after being inspired by advancements in food and popular art, such as the air plant and 3D printed food created by Chloe Retzerveld, we settled on a final design. This design would address our concerns of which gas to use, as we decided on hydrogen produced by bacteria, and our problem with flammability, as we designed a mycelium shell and lining, which is naturally flame retardant material or resists fire.
So still the question remained of how we would actually make it fly, and we had to consider whether we would want to use helium or hydrogen, as we definitely looked at using a gas that would be lighter than air to make it lift off from the ground. So we realized that helium sounded like the more like the simplest answer to this, but it's also really hard to create naturally and basically impossible on the Earth. So we turned to hydrogen, which, although not usually used because it it's very combustible, is still able to, is still lighter than air and could lift our plant up. So we decided that it can be produced naturally using bacteria. There are many different bacteria that can produce hydrogen gas using sugars such as glucose, which could be absorbed from the plant. And then there would be a bioengineered film inside the bottom of the spherical plant structure, which would allow the hydrogen gas to stay contained as it would be an airtight seal.
So we chose to use mycelium because it's a really strong material. It's naturally flame retardant, and it's also self-extinguishing if it does catch on fire. And mycelium is analogous to the roots of a tree. It's the vegetative part of a mushroom, and it can grow mushrooms, and it also helps extend the nutrient range of the mushroom, like the mushrooms growing on it. And it has a web-like structure, and it's often found submerged in a host like wood or a vegetable or in soil. And but we chose to use mycelium that grows on wood, so wood fungus mycelium, because it has a high heat resistance, and this is to protect against possible combustion of our product. And it naturally absorbs water and nutrients from the soil, so we would find a way to biologically engineer it so that the plant could also benefit from the mycelium's absorption.
So we decided that for the actual plant, we would use a hydroponic plant, which can get its nutrients from water and nutrients that are inserted into the water instead of soil, so that it could still survive as it floats in the atmosphere. And we would keep the plant small so that it would be light enough to be picked up by the wind and carried, and also so that there would not be huge amounts of hydrogen needed to lift it into the air.
Okay, so in terms of the future, we came up with this idea as a solution to increasing CO2 levels because it'll allow more plant area in our environment, as the plant life cycle would start in the ground but continue up into the sky, freeing land for future crops and also allowing for an environmental aesthetic in our increasingly industrial world. This raises a lot of questions and possibilities for our plant as to how it could be engineered in the future, for what it could filter and other uses that it could have. So I'd like to show you the diagram. You can turn it. So we made a diagram, or I made a diagram. Prototype, there we go. Using real moss and soil. And we wanted to show how our crops would start off with only the plant part budding out, and the mycelium would be in the ground so it could absorb up the water, and then slowly they would come up and float. So thank you. It's lit.